Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Franca Tamaris and I'm the Events Coordinator at the Melbourne Energy Institute. Thank you all for joining us today for the Australian Energy Market Operators Quarterly Energy Dynamic Report for the period October to December 2022 with Dr Shaun Hooper. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that today we are gathered on the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We'll also invite you to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which you are listening. A bit of housekeeping for this online event. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box as the chat function is disabled. We will take some breaks throughout the session to field questions, which we will try to get through as many as we can. Now to introduce our speaker for today, Dr Shaun Hooper is the Manager Market Insights at AEMO. His role covers publishing the quarterly energy dynamic reports, a flagship AEMO publication, and producing insights into the development and design of the Australian energy markets. Prior to joining AEMO, Shaun held various roles in the energy sector, covering risk management, finance, settlements, commercial analysis and advisory at different generation, retail and consultancy companies. Shaun is a physicist by training, acquiring a PhD from the University of Western Australia and a Bachelor of Science, majoring in mathematics and physics from Monash University. Today's moderator is Professor Pierluigi Mancarella, who is Chair Professor of Electrical Power Systems at the University of Melbourne and Professor of Smart Energy Systems at the University of Manchester in the UK. His key research interests include techno-economic modelling and analysis of multi-energy systems, grid integration of renewables and distributed energy resources, energy infrastructure planning under uncertainty, and security, reliability and resilience of low-carbon networks. Pierluigi is also the Energy Systems Program Leader at the Melbourne Energy Institute. We welcome them both today. I would now like to hand over to Dr Shaun Hooper. Thank you.
Thanks, Franca. Great. Well, get into it. So in this report, I'll discuss the Q4 22 outcomes across the Australian energy markets in the NEM and the East Coast gas markets. So the NEM this quarter, or Q4 22, saw record high prices, $93 a megawatt hour, which is significantly higher than Q4 21, but it's also come down significantly from Q2 and Q3 prices earlier in the year, when we saw $216 on average in Q3, so a lot lower prices. Large reason for that is lower operational demand. Just seasonally, Q4 is a lower demand period, although year on year we did see a lower operational demand. And as I'll go through the presentation, we'll see some large shifts in generation supply, with the lowest coal generation, lowest quarterly output for coal since market start, and all of that pretty much being displaced by increasing renewables quarter on quarter. So much so that we saw the instantaneous renewable penetration at 68.7%, which was an increase from the prior quarter. And I'll cover briefly the changes on the East Coast gas markets, where we saw similar sort of things. A high Q4 price, around $18 a gigajoule, but still coming down a lot from earlier in the year. And I'll discuss some of the demand changes and impacts on Queensland export LNG demand. All right, so just to talk about operational demand here. So for those unaware, operational demand is a term that AEMO uses to define the amount of energy that's supplied to the grid. So since 2014, 2015-ish, that's not the only amount of generation that goes to the end consumer's demand, with the gap, the difference being rooftop PV, or as we call it, distributed PV. So that's what the chart on the left is showing. It's showing since 2014, the operational demand, which again is the amount of generation that's being supplied from the grid. And in the teal at the top is the underlying demand. So that's operational demand plus the distributed PV to get to that amount of consumption that customers in aggregate use. So we can see year on year, the underlying demand hasn't really changed that much. And from Q4, so these are just Q4s. So from Q4 21 to Q4 22, underlying demand hasn't changed that much, but operational demand is declining year on year. And this year it's gone down 410 megawatts, or roughly 16%. So the reason why it's gone down is mostly to do with an increase in distributed PV, which has increased year on year 16%. So the chart on the right shows the same thing, but just in a different view. So it shows the changes from Q4 21 to Q4 22 by time of day. So the red dotted line here shows the change in operational demand. And as you can see, pretty much all of the operational demand changes has been in the middle of the day. And that's because there's been this increase in distributed PV. So a lot more rooftop PV. Most of that's coming from New South Wales and Queensland by region, with some small changes in Victoria. And then you can see in the grey shaded area, that's the change in underlying demand. So much like the flat number across the day, it hasn't really changed too much. So the operational demand is really decreasing because we've seen an increase in distributed PV. So moving on to minimum and maximum demands. So AEMO measures both minimum and maximum demands as a function of to monitor system stability and acknowledging the decreasing synchronous generation we have. So across the NEM, across the whole NEM, we saw the lowest record minimum demand of 12,000 megawatts on the 6th of November at a time of the day, middle of the day, when 46% of underlying demand was met by distributed PV. So that's shown somewhat regionally here on the left. So just the 4 mainland NEM regions. Each region has, so these are just Q4 minimums. So we see a record low, all-time low in Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, and a Q4 low for Queensland. So in particular, the South Australia had its lowest ever demand at 100 megawatts, which is not too far different from Q4 21. But it's worth pointing out this 100 megawatts still happened when South Australia was connected to the rest of them, which I'll cover in a later slide. Happened the 1300-hour time period, and that happened when 93% of distributed PV was meeting underlying demand. And then the chart on the right shows the changes in maximum demand. So what we can see for the last 3 quarters, last 3 Q4s in New South Wales and Queensland, that maximum demand has been coming down. Part of the reason for Q4 22's lower maximum demand was La Nina having a cooling effect on the sort of shoulder to summer period, especially later in the quarter, and fewer extreme temperature days, which meant we didn't have that high demand. And in Victoria, we see a slight increase just as businesses return to following normal economic activity. Moving on. So in talking about prices, like I mentioned at the start, we saw very high prices across the quarter. So the chart on the left here shows that average price broken down by each of the 5 NEM regions for 3 quarters. So in the red, we've got Q4 21, so that last Q4. In the purple, we've got the lighter purple, we've got Q3 22, so the immediately preceding quarter, and this darker purple color is Q4 22. And just to point out, the shaded area there is the contribution to the average price from prices that are above $300 a megawatt hour. So it's commonly referred to as the cap price or cap returns. So that's a measure of volatility, which I'll cover in a later slide. So the top of the stack is the average price. So we can see compared to the purple columns, it's come down significantly across all states, but it's still up compared to Q4 21. So it's worth pointing out in Q4 22, we saw this large separation between the northern states of Queensland and New South Wales, averaging here around $120-ish, to the southern regions of Victoria and South Australia. So it's quite a price separation there. Tasmania had high prices, and the reasons for Tasmanian prices are a little bit different. Tasmania had a 49-day outage following a major transmission line, and that caused local issues, which again I'll cover in another slide. But we also saw Tasmania having offers from hydro plants moving their offers into higher price bands. But back to the difference between the northern and southern regions, so the northern being Queensland, New South Wales, and the southern regions, Victoria and South Australia. The chart on the right just shows that growing separation. So the chart on the right is average prices by time of day, with Q4 21 on the left side and Q4 22 on the right side. The light blue color is the average New South Wales price as a function of time, and the darker blue is on the bottom is the average Victorian price, with the grey area being the price separation between the two, the differences in prices between the two regions. So generally, prices across the NEM should remain close to each other, accounting for losses in an unconstrained environment. And then what we saw this quarter, similar to Q4, we saw the Victoria-New South Wales interconnector binding quite often, particularly in the middle of the day, but also in the morning and evening, so throughout the day. It didn't bind, so when that binding happens, that means there's only so much energy that can flow from lower price regions into higher price regions, and that's where we see that price separation occur. So as comparing Q4 to Q4 21 to Q4 22, VNI didn't bind significantly more, but what we saw is when it was binding, the prices set in New South Wales and Queensland were significantly higher than those set in Victoria and South Australia, which is what this chart shows. It's a little bit hard to see. It's the separation is increasing across the times, not just during the middle of the day. Some of the reasons for those price differences I'll go into in the next slide. So taking a different view on that, so here we show the NEM price setters by fuel type. So the chart on the left, which has a lot of information here, shows each region, so the 5 regions, and it shows Q4 21 and Q4 22, and the percentage of time each the price was being set where the marginal price generator had a different fuel source. So it's the percentage of time by fuel type. So we can see in Tasmania, Q4 21 to Q4 22, this blue, which is hydro generation, sets the price 70% of the time. There's not a lot of changes there. Just worth pointing out that when it did set the price, it was setting prices at a higher price because of issues we saw in Tasmania. Despite a lot of rainfall in some parts of Tasmania, there wasn't much rainfall in other parts of Tasmania, as well as the 49-day outage that I talked about previously. And then in the other southern regions, South Australia, Victoria, we can see around in Q4 22, roughly 30% of the time in South Australia, prices were being set by grid-scale solar, which is the yellow, and wind, which is the green, just about 30% of the time, which is an increase from Q4 21. And in Victoria, it was 23% of the time, but a similar increase in prices being set by wind and grid-scale solar, which is significant because they're setting the prices generally at negative or very low prices. And in the northern regions, New South Wales and Queensland, there's an increase in grid-scale solar setting the price, obviously in the middle of the day, also wind. And what we saw is a reduction of black coal setting the price in both New South Wales and Queensland, which is which forms part of the story of how Q4 differs from Q4 22 differs from Q4 21. So the percentage of time that black coal has been setting the price in New South Wales and Queensland has decreased. So on the right, we show the average price when across the mainland NEM regions, so the 4 mainland NEM regions, when the price was being set by that particular fuel type. So in Q4 21, when black coal was setting the price in the 4 NEM regions, mainland NEM regions, the average price was $67 a megawatt hour, and that jumped up to $111 this Q4 22. So quite an increase. Again, I'll go through that in some more slides, but we can see it's come down significantly from Q3. So that's a large reason why those prices the average NEM prices have come down. So even though New South Wales and Queensland, the amount of time black coal has been setting the price is reduced, when it is setting the price, it's setting it at a much higher price, which is a large reason why prices increased. Gas didn't set the price too often, or it doesn't even quite a bit. Still very high gas prices. And then you'll see hydro plant optimizing their portfolios and bidding in to maximize that portfolio. Okay, moving away from price setters, just to talk a little bit more on coal, and black coal in particular. So what we saw is a change in bid volumes. So similar to Q3, Q4, but Q2 and Q3, sorry. But just concentrating on Q4, comparing Q4 21 to Q4 22, the chart on the left shows the average volume in a given price band offered into the market. So for New South Wales black coal generators and Queensland black coal generators. So what we can see in New South Wales, there was around 5,500 megawatts offered at or below $100 a megawatt hour. So that's what this dotted line here denotes in Q4 21. And then that number has dropped to about 1,200 megawatts. So 1,200 megawatts of volume that was offered at below $100 a megawatt hour has been shifted into higher price bands for Q4 22. It was 1,200 megawatt reduction in New South Wales black coal generators, and about 600 megawatts for Queensland black coal generators. Also just worth pointing out that to put this into context, the change in operational demand was around 450 megawatts. The chart on the right just gives an indication of where the global market prices export quality coal. So this is New South Wales export thermal coal. So it's just indicative of coal. It's not exactly this, it's not necessarily the same coal that it's not directly linked to domestic prices, but it's what cargoes have been shipped for. So we can see the average Q4 price still quite high. It's coming down a little bit from Q3, about $34 a tonne, but on average it's still quite high. Comparing that to Q4 21, it's about twice the cost, twice the price rather. So there's a number of reasons for that, but just to put that into context, black coal on the eastern border of Australia has increased in value. Okay. Moving on to price volatility. So as I mentioned earlier, the energy sector measures volatility by measuring what the cap returns or the average price above $300 a megawatt hour in the quarter is. If we collect all of the prices that are above $300 a megawatt hour, subtract $300 and take the average of that, these are the prices you'll get for the different regions, different colours mean different regions for the last 13 Q4s. So in Q4 22, which is the rightmost one here, we see a large cap return contribution around $14 a megawatt hour from Tasmania, which is unusual since Tasmania doesn't usually have high, Tasmania's in the green, which doesn't usually have high Q4 prices, and also South Australia in the orange here. So just delving into that $14 or so a little bit more detail, what we saw was of that $14, $2 came from the line outage, which I mentioned the first day of the line outage, where an initial response to that Tasmania prices increased significantly, and the loss of local generation and interconnector load support. And then later on the 14th, so when there was still a transmission outage, on the 14th of November, when South Australia had its event, which I'll talk about in a minute, there was significant issues there with very tight supply-demand situation, with Victoria requiring energy and flows were limited across Basslink. Very tight supply-demand there, with Tasmanian prices shooting up. So that was most of Tasmania's $14. And then in South Australia, I'll have a slide on this later, but what we saw was a trip on a tower failure on the Talon Bend to Southeast transmission line, which connects South Australia to the southeast part of South Australia to the rest of the NEM. So we saw that trip happen, and that effectively separated South Australia from the rest of the NEM. So it synchronously separated it. So we saw prices differ in South Australia to the rest of the NEM following that tower failure. And although during the time we didn't see major issues, there were times when supply and demand was tight, and we saw sharp drops in cheap available energy, and that sort of caused those price spikes. So it happened on various days across the week until the line was repaired and South Australia was returned to synchronous alignment with the rest of the NEM. And in aggregate, that was $5.40 of cap prices. Moving on to forward prices, the last slide before we'll just take a bit of a break. So stepping back a bit, this slide here shows the market's expectation of forward prices throughout the prior year. So these are calendar 23 prices for the 4 mainland NEM regions. It's what the market viewed those prices at, the settled prices going back a year or so. A year or so, we could see that the market valued calendar 23 at around $50, $60 a megawatt hour, depending on which region we're in. And as the year progressed, as we got closer to calendar 23, prices started to increase. Even though it's a forward price, it's reflected, it's partly driven by what's happening in the spot market at that point in time. And in particular, at the end of so May, June, when we saw the energy crisis, we saw large spot prices that reflects into forward prices. So that's what that caused that big jump there. Other reasons as well, international pressures, international gas prices, international coal prices, lots of factors that go into what sets the forward price. At the start of the quarter, at the start of Q4 22, the Cal 23 prices were still trading quite high, very historically high. They moved up even more as we moved into the quarter. And then around November, there were announcements that the government was looking into impose price caps on energy, coal and gas. And when the government did announce the cap on gas prices, we saw a significant decrease in calendar 23 prices across the mainland regions. So that's a sharp drop there. So those forward calendar prices, I think they dropped further and then picked up a little bit in January, February, but they're still trading much lower than the start of Q4 22. And then also this is just calendar 2023, but on the right-hand side, we show the New South Wales calendar-based contracts for calendar 23, 24, and 25. And at the end of Q3 22, prices were trading up here, so that $240 is this price up here, and we can see that's come down significantly. So even though the government's intervention to the gas prices only lasts for a year, we've seen forward prices in calendar 24 and calendar 25 come down as well. Okay, happy to take a break there and then go through any questions.
Thank you, Shaun. That's very, very interesting, comprehensive as always. I would like to invite everyone to use the Q&A option, just in case you may have some questions. So I don't see any at the moment, but please feel free to put them down, and then I'll just have a look and I will ask questions, Shaun, when relevant, maybe a later break. Shaun, can I ask you a couple of things? Again, it's super interesting. Could you elaborate a little bit as to what happened? Was like 19 November with the volatility event in Tasmania. Can you go back to the point? It was
Sure.
pretty unusual, and yeah, if you could just sort of elaborate a little bit more on that, because something happened physically, and then it introduces volatility. Please, thanks.
Sure. Yeah, you're right. It is pretty complicated. There was lots of things happening. AEMO has published a preliminary report on it, which I encourage you to look at for further details. But yes, my understanding, there was a landslide that affected the foundation of a transmission line, stripped that transmission line, and effectively separated the north of the state, where you have a lot of generation, to the south of the state, where there's a lot of load. So that trip put pressure on different lines. Just moved around a lot of the constraints in the dispatch engine. We also saw supply to Tasmania from the mainland from Basslink being limited, and we saw limited amount of generation coming out of from Tasmania generators as well, and also load being affected. So I'm not sure if I have much more detail to give than that, Pierluigi, but
no, that was very helpful. So actually, something happening in Tasmania really broke somehow the system was inside Tasmania. I see.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Tasmania is an interesting one where we have like the the eastern half of the state has all the loaders. You have the eastern and northeastern side with a lot of hydro generation. Yes, it's complex environment.
Yeah, no, okay, man. But say you had to change all the constraint equations in Tasmania, and this affected everything else. Basically, that's okay. I'll definitely have a look. It looks really, really interesting. And there is a question from the audience. It's about the negative prices in Victoria. Like, what has been driving negative prices in Victoria, particularly very recently? Yesterday morning was minus $38 per megawatt hour. Only there to then jump to $360 per megawatt hour in the afternoon.
It's a very good question, and it's very interesting to see that. Like many others, have a live view of prices, and actually positive in Victoria at the moment. But yes, earlier today, most of the time when the sun is up in South Australia and Victoria, the prices are negative, and large reason for that is just the low demand during the middle of the day. It's already lower in the day just because it's not peak period, but then added on top of that is distributed PV, which doesn't compete with grid generation. It's the first energy that gets used. So the operational demand is just very low in the middle of the day. And in New South Wales, well, across the NEMs, not just Victoria and South Australia, there is wind and solar, which I'll show in further slides, which just are bidding in at negative prices. So they generally would bid in at negative prices because renewable generators will receive the large-scale energy certificates, which they can sell and do sell to retailers, and the market price for those is around, give or take, it's moved around a bit, it's around minus $60. So if you're a wind generator, you'd be happy to, with wind or solar, you'd be happy to generate at negative $60. Obviously, you prefer the price to be higher, but at negative $60, it's a break even. So that's why we see throughout the day just negative prices almost every day.
Thank you. Thanks, Shaun. That was very very clear. I'm not seeing other questions, so I would suggest to go on with your presentation. And again, I would like to invite everyone to just put the questions in the Q&A box, and then I will moderate all the questions at the next break. Thank you. Please, Shaun, go ahead. Thanks.
All right, I'll stay on the topic of electricity and just talk a little bit more about the generation side, see the changes in physical generation. So the chart here on the left, which is called the sunrise chart for obvious reasons, shows the changes in generation by fuel type, which is the different colors, across the time of day. So it changes from Q4 21 to Q4 22. So if you recall the earlier chart where I said underlying demand across the day hasn't really changed very much, that's what the net of this is. So if you add up all the positives on the positive axis and the negatives on the negative axis, you'll get roughly a straight line. So it's underlying demand because this chart includes the changes in distributed PV. So on the positive axis, we see large increases in grid-scale solar, which was 350 megawatts on average, and distributed PV, which is 410 megawatts on average. So it's quite a significant increase there. And wind, pretty much across the day, there's been an increase on average 290 megawatts. And those are the main increases. So wind and grid-scale solar and TPV, and a little bit of hydro. So the blue is hydro. So hydro is more shifting around. So it's generating more in the early morning and evening peak when prices are higher, and they're generating less during the middle of the day where prices are lower. So that's sliced there. But overall, there hasn't been that much changes in hydro generation. But what we have seen a big decrease is in, and I'll go through this in the next slide as well, is coal. So both brown coal and this slice here is from Victoria has decreased significantly, and black coal, which is this black color here. So black coal's come down significantly. On average, it's about 800 megawatts across the quarter from Q4 21. And as you can see in particular, it's decreased across the middle of the day. So I'll cover this a little bit more here. So the chart on the right shows the output, the average output across the quarter by time of day for New South Wales black coal generators. So for the last 4 quarters, 4 Q4s. So we can see year on year, they're decreasing the amount of output, particularly in the middle of the day, like the evening peak, morning peak, evening peak stays roughly the same. That middle of the day is really just being carved out. In particular here, we're looking at, this is all New South Wales black coal generators, but in particular, Eraring and Bayswater are lowering the utilisation rate by decreasing the output during the middle of the day. This does include, just for reference, the difference between Q4 21 and Q4 22 is roughly 250 megawatts from Liddell Unit 3 being taken out permanently. But it's just thought it was worth pointing out that flexing of the New South Wales black coal fleet has increased. So I'll move on, but just keep this in mind when I talk a little bit more about the coal generators. So as I mentioned, it's the lowest quarterly output for black and brown coal, both individually and in aggregate since NEM start. But separating those two out on the chart on the left shows just the Q4 since market start, that average output has decreased to its lowest ever. It is for any quarter, not just Q4s, but the chart just made more sense to have it as Q4s. And yeah, probably worth just noting these numbers. It's around 9,000, 9,500 megawatts of black coal output and 340 megawatts of brown coal output. So there's essentially 2 reasons why the black coal has decreased so much. We've talked about it quite a bit, and I'll just re-emphasize it again. In New South Wales, 1,200 megawatts of low price coal has been shifted out into higher price bands. Somewhat to do with international pressures, but also the middle of the day, coal in the middle of the day is being displaced, which was the chart I just previously showed, and it's being replaced by solar and wind, which is setting the price at a much lower price than coal previously did. So they're effectively being priced out of that middle part of the day. And then in Queensland, we see a similar thing happening, but also in Queensland, we see an increase in outages. So that's what the chart on the right shows. There's not that much of a change in New South Wales Black Coal's outages. Well, there is a change. There is an increase, but particularly in Queensland, we see around 630 megawatts increased outages on average across Q4. So probably about 2/3 of that, give or take, is Kogan Creek. So Kogan Creek is a black coal generator in Queensland, which had a major overhaul lasting from the 17th of September to the 20th of December, so pretty much the whole quarter. And then separately, Catalyst C3 unit had an unexpected outage on the 31st of December, and that's, to my knowledge, still yet to be returned to service. They had its return to service date pushed out, and it's due to come back in later this year. So that's probably the other third of that outage there. So that also explains why we've seen that reduction in output for Queensland coal generators. So moving away from coal and to the wind and grid-scale solar output. So across the quarter, as I mentioned a few times, on the positive axis, we saw this increase in grid-scale solar, around 350 megawatts in aggregate, mostly from New South Wales and Queensland, with Victorian grid-scale solar actually decreasing. And then we see increases in wind across all states except for Tasmania, with on average about 290 megawatts of increase. So 290 plus the 360 or so of grid-scale solar is an increase of 650, give or take, of wind and grid-scale solar. So the chart on the right just tries to explain that change a little bit more. So from previous quarter here being Q4 21, we saw 3,900 megawatts going up by 650 megawatts to 4,500 megawatts in Q4 22. So the changes were largely driven by increased output from commissioning and new capacity. So the differences there, commissioning, we just isolate wind and grid units, grid-scale solar units that were present in and generating in Q4 21, but these developments take a while to start to reach their full capacity, so they're still ramping up. So just ramping up is another name there for that commissioning. And then new capacity is just brand new units that weren't delivering any energy or pretty much no energy in Q4 21. So large increases there quarter on quarter. Offsetting that was a decrease from curtailment. So as in this increased curtailment, which means there's a reduction in output. So it's 43 megawatts, so quite a large base, so it's not really that much of an increase. So those curtailments are due to network constraints, system strength and network constraints, mostly network constraints in this case. So just when energy can't move around so much because lines are constrained. There was an increase in curtailment by market response, which is what offloading is here. So because prices were negative quite a lot of the time, we saw some wind and grid-scale solar generators not making all of their energy available as it would be uneconomic to operate in that market. So again, it's a relatively small change given the amount of increase in renewable output from new players. And then the 80 megawatts, to round it out, is the change in capacity factor. So that's just for existing wind and grid-scale solar, things like increased wind or increased solar radiation. So it's a bit of a mixed story there. It's a bit hard to sort of unpack it all, but we saw increased wind speeds essentially in South Australia and South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales. For wind, in aggregate, the existing grid fleet saw a lower amount of output for lower solar radiation, but that was mostly weighted by Victoria, which is this part here. Whereas the existing grid-scale fleets in New South Wales and Queensland actually had higher amount of solar output, which which makes sense when we looked at the distributed PV increasing mostly in New South Wales, Queensland. And then one last slide on renewable energy. So this quarter, same as Q3 and I believe Q2, we saw the highest, we saw a new instantaneous renewable penetration record of 68.7%, which is about 4% higher than the previous one. It happened on the 28th of October, in the middle of the day between 12 and 12:30, which is what this chart on the left is showing. It's showing the total NEM output by fuel source on the 28th of October. So that dotted line there just shows the separation between renewable and non-renewable energy. And you can see right in the middle of the day that pretty much 2/3 of energy was coming from renewable sources, mostly almost half of that from distributed PV, grid-scale solar, and wind. So it's not shown on this chart, and we don't normally call it out in the Q&A because we're managing the entire network as a single entity. But when the South Australia Island event happened, which again I'll cover in 1 or 2 slides, that region was electrically isolated from the rest of the NEM. And during that 1 week period, I think on the second last day, the 18th, we saw at 9:30 in the morning, 9:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time, we saw instantaneous renewable penetration record of 91.5%, with at that point in time distributed PV contributing 55%. And then the chart on the right just shows some interesting facts about grid-scale solar, wind, and distributed PV. So at a point in time, and for the distributed PV, it's measured on a half-hourly scale, there was a maximum output of the collective distributed PV across the NEM of 10.5 gigawatts. So that happened on the 27th of December, which you can see is a record, and it's just increasing year on year as more people install rooftop solar. That's about double what grid-scale solar was. So the grid-scale solar peak here was on a different day, but you can see that that's increasing, quarter on quarter as well. And although it wasn't a record, wind instantaneous output is also just increasing pretty much every quarter. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about storage revenues because that was quite interesting this quarter. So within the NEM, for the last few quarters, this chart on the left shows the net revenue. So the yellow dots is the net revenue of batteries in the NEM. So we can see in Q4 21, the net revenue was around $14 million. So that increased to $42 million this quarter, significantly higher. And we did see high revenues in Q2 and Q3. A lot of those high revenues in Q2 and Q3 were due to energy arbitrage. So as we've talked about in previous quarters, those Q2 and Q3 energy prices were extreme, and batteries made most of their revenue through charging when prices were low and selling when prices were high. Whereas this quarter, we still did see a good amount of that down here. So that's shown by the purple, which is revenue when it's discharging into high prices, and red when it's negative revenue because it's charging from the grid. But this quarter, what we saw was a very large increase in frequency control and ancillary service revenue, so revenue from the FCAS markets. So particularly the contingency, which is that sort of teal color, and regulation as well in the green. So most of that increase in FCAS revenue was from South Australia, and in particular the Hornsdale Power Reserve and Dalrymple batteries. And most of that is from when they were supporting the large share of South Australia's contingency FCAS requirements during the 7-day synchronous separation of South Australia, or most of South Australia, from the rest of the NEM. So I'll cover that in the next slide, but very high FCAS revenues there. And then just to put that into comparison, on the right shows the pumped hydro revenues over here. So little bit down from last Q4 21. And of note there is that you didn't see those high extreme prices above $300 a megawatt hour. So previously pumped hydro has been used a lot when prices go above $300 to capture that revenue, whereas this quarter still high energy revenues there. All right, so talk a little bit more about the SA Island event. So as I mentioned a few times, there was a major transmission event in South Australia that led to the synchronous separation of most of South Australia from the rest of the NEM. So that happened on the 12th of November. So the chart on the left shows the time. So that's when that happened, the 12th of November. And the line wasn't repaired, wasn't resynchronized to the rest of the NEM until about a week later, late on the 19th. So when this separation happened, this synchronously separates South Australia from the rest of the NEM. So and we need to maintain frequency around 50 hertz in South Australia. So under normal circumstances, F-gas requirements can be sourced from anywhere in the NEM. But since South Australia was synchronously separated from the rest of the NEM, it needs to source F-gas requirements from local generation and local load. So as such, the supply-demand balance increases. There's increased demand for F-gas from local services and decreased availability from low-price volumes. So decreasing competition means there's greater capacity for units to bid, dispatch into higher price bands. So what we saw is each of the 8 F-gas markets, there's 8 F-gas markets in South Australia, which at this point are priced separately from the rest of the NEM, saw very high volatility with each of the F-gas markets, except for the lower 60-second market, seeing prices reach the market price cap of $15,500 a megawatt hour. So as the case is with energy market, and as what happened in June 22 in the energy markets, which is a different story, those high F-gas prices on the morning of the 13th, which is shown here, they increase. So the market has a rule that the cumulative price, so the cumulative F-gas prices in each market for the last 7 days, so the rolling sum of the last 7 days, if that number, which is what this cumulative price is, so the cumulative price again is the rolling 7 day sum of prices. If that price exceeds a threshold, which I'm not sure if it's rendered correctly on this presentation, but it's around $1.4 million. If any of the markets go above that, any of the F-gas markets go above, if the cumulative price goes above that threshold, we enter what's called administered pricing period, which is what happened on the 14th, when the first F-gas market, the lower regulation F-gas price exceeded that threshold. The cumulative price exceeded that threshold because prices were just so high. So once that happens, we're into administered pricing period, and we'll remain into administered pricing period until all of the F-gas markets' cumulative price comes back below the threshold. So the cumulative price is calculated off what the uncapped price would be. So once the administered pricing period begins, F-gas prices are capped at $300 a megawatt hour in all markets. But the cumulative price number here, which determines whether we're in the administered pricing periods, remains being calculated off the uncapped price. So we can see during this week of separation, the demand for those F-gas services was still very high, and the uncapped price was still going very high above $300 a megawatt hour, which kept pushing the cumulative price higher and higher, which again, similar story to the June events, but it's different series of events. So the purple is the lower cumulative price. For reference, the teal here is the raised red cumulative price. The other frequent F-gas services also exceeded, I think all but one exceeded the threshold. And then once late on the 19th, when South Australia was resynchronized with the rest of the NEM, the F-gas prices started to come down, which meant that cumulative price started to come down. And if you work it through it, it's going to take pretty much a week, because it crosses the threshold in 1 day. So it takes 7 days essentially for that to come off. And it's the last of the services to come out of the cumulative price to come below the threshold, which happened on the 26th, which we came out of the administered pricing period. So it was quite a mouthful, but yeah, we saw for this week very high F-gas prices, which on the right shows the total F-gas costs. I believe this is South Australia. So Q4 F-gas costs were around $35, $36 million. And as you can see in context, that's much higher than previous quarters. And that's all pretty much from that 1 week of high F-gas prices. And I believe I'll pause there again for any questions before we move on to gas.
Thanks, Shaun. Thanks again. Always very somehow exciting seeing when some separation event happens, all the consequences. Can I ask you just a quick one for myself? Can you go back to slide 12, please? I think I missed. So what happened there to Victoria Solar, Grid Solar in the one?
Sure.
I missed that.
That's right. It is a complicated one, so we'll try to put through a lot of information here. So I was just pointing out here that most of this increase in the 650 megawatts of increase in VRE or wind and grid-scale solar is from both wind and grid new wind and grid-scale solar developments. About half of it is from grid-scale solar. But most of those new developments and most of this increase in grid-scale solar is coming from New South Wales, Queensland. So in Victoria, we actually saw, and I'm not exactly sure, but I don't think there was too many, I don't think there was any new solar farms. So what I was pointing out here in the capacity factor side is that the balancing item, which basically says for the existing fleet, that was the same fleet that was in Q4 21 to Q4 22, did we see an increased amount of solar radiation or decrease? And for solar, it was actually a negative. So there was less solar radiation for Q4 22 compared to Q4 21, but that's mostly because of Victoria. Like the existing grid-scale solar farms in Queensland saw an increased amount of sunshine.
Right. Okay. So it was really like weather-driven effect, not so much curtailment or other things. Okay. Okay. Great. No, that's okay. Even more interesting. We clearly see the effects then of weather year by year. That's great. So there are a few questions from the audience. One is we are basically seeing a lot more variable energy and the black hole getting more and more outages, planned and unplanned, as you showed. What's the implication for ancillary services with increase of renewables and decrease of synchronous generators?
Let's see this one here. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So you're right, the thermal generators can provide inertial services and frequency control. You do see in gas as well, we saw that a lot. So there were reduced amounts of directions in South Australia this quarter, and a lot of that has to do with the 4 syncons operating in South Australia. So the syncons make a big difference for that, and batteries as well. So we see that. See during the SA Island event, batteries providing a significant amount of F-gas services. And in the report, we do actually show of all the F-gas markets, batteries as a fuel source provided 38% of those services. So there are alternatives to thermal generation to maintain synchronous generation.
Thanks. And there is another, linked question that is about, again, black coal and the need for greater ramping and flexing of the fleet. So is this leading, particularly during the day because of solar, as you were showing, is this leading to operational maintenance issues to the point that there are more outages, or actually they're flexible enough now to manage?
It's a really good question. I've asked that question myself, actually. I've seen tell people that if we look at this flexing here of New South Wales black coal, when that's not something that we're previously doing. My understanding is that that black coal generators are quite resilient, and that the boilers can take quite a lot of temperature difference in terms of, because really what's happening here is it's heating up and cooling down. Like within the day, you're either burning more coal or not, and temperatures increase or decrease. So that does have to put some amount of stress on the plant. But my understanding is black coal generators in particular are very good at managing that flex. Not so much brown coal generators, but definitely some of the black coal generators can and do flex up. I guess what's not shown here is some black generators, New South Wales black generators, prefer to just run flat out through the day, and others are happy to flex.
So Shaun, effectively, black coal generators would be much more flexible than brown coal generators. Actually, that's what you see. All right, okay, that's
right. If you've ever seen the difference between a black coal generator and a brown coal generator, the boiler is, I'm not sure how many times higher, but it's much bigger, because essentially because the moisture content of brown coal is so high that you need to burn a lot of it to get the same amount of energy.
That's interesting. There are a couple more questions, but I suggest to go on with the presentation, then we'll take the questions later. Thank you.
No worries. All right, so I'll take a break from electricity, and I'll just cover the changes in the East Coast gas markets in a few slides. As mentioned, similar to electricity, we saw high prices. So the chart on the left here shows the DWGM, which is the spot gas market in Victoria, and the Brisbane STM market in purple. You see throughout the middle of last year, those prices got up to the $40 a gigajoule level, very high, and then coming down to $20 or so. It's still quite high, but compared to Q4 21 and previously, compared to the middle of the year, it's come down significantly. It's a little bit more subtle, but you can see that the December price has eased, and a lot of that has to do with lower demand from warm weather, as well as lower gas-fired generation, and in particular the QC LNG train outage, which meant there was more domestic supply. So I'll show on the next slide, but Queensland LNG had two separate unplanned outages, one from mid-October to mid-November, and then one later in December, which pretty much took out a lot of gas that would have otherwise gone to the LNG export facilities. So in reference, and we'll just put this here to give a bit of context, the blue line here, or the teal line, is the ACCC netback price. And in particular, that dotted line there is the ACCC expectation of forward price. So it's not really shown here, but that forward price has been coming down with progressive updates. And it's been easing because we've seen Northern Hemisphere, particularly European winter, wasn't as bad as otherwise thought. We've seen European gas, demand for European gas being stored and having adequate supplies in advance of winter. And then just quickly, I'll touch on it because it was interesting. The price cap legislation, which began on the 23rd of December, which limited gas supply contracts to $12 a gigajoule, doesn't actually apply to the DWGM here or the STTMs because those are spot markets. And it also doesn't apply to the gas supply hub up to the 3-day limit, so in the spot period. And only really applies to the forward-looking period where people are contracting gas. So it didn't make a huge impact on this Q4. So on the right, just to give another context to those gas prices, so you can see bids, the band of prices of marginal offers, so in different for different prices. So we can see last Q4, 70% of prices were priced at or below $18, $14 to $18 making joule. So half of them were priced below $14, much cheaper. And then through the energy crisis, through Q3 22, we saw large amounts of gas being, large amounts of bids being offered at above $25 a gigajoule, so very high prices. And it's a bit subtle to see, but this Q4, so October, November, December, it's a little bit harder to see, but there's been an increase of those lower price offers. So still historically high, like $10, $12 a gigajoule, but we're seeing a reintroduction of those lower gas prices. So that's part of the reason why this price has come down, which again is somewhat been driven by QCLNG, which I'll cover in the next slide. All right, so this chart here on the left shows the quarterly flows to Curtis Highland, where the LNG trains are, and the highlighted columns are for Q4s for the last few years. So we can see this Q4 is reduced from last Q4. Sorry about the labeling, but it's come down, and it's actually the lowest since 2018. It's also the lowest quarter for the QCLNG, which is in red. So there's 3 LNG projects, and generally QCLNG's second highest flows, whereas this quarter it's really come down, and the reason for that, as I mentioned before, that there was 2 separate outages. So also traditionally Q4 is the period of time when gas flows from southern markets to Queensland. So you've got lower demand in the southern regions where it's not needed for heating demand, and gas flows north. So that's what this chart on the right is showing. It's flows on the southwest Queensland pipeline at Moomba, so then through Moomba north. So this part here over to the right, so we can see it's 14 PJs or so of gas net that's moved north, and so it's still going north, but it is reduced from Q4 21, and yeah, that's coincided with the decrease in Queensland LNG flows and more domestic supply being available associated with those LNG projects. So this northerly flows potentially would have been even lower, but continuing supplies from the Northern Territory via the Northern Gas Pipeline meant that supplies were required from Queensland and from the southern markets to meet that demand, mostly in Mount Isa, where the Northern Gas Pipeline ends. Just talk about that in a little bit more detail. The chart on the left shows 2 things. It shows the Queensland domestic supply in the teal, and the purple, the Victorian exports. So just talking about the teal, the Queensland domestic supply. So as I mentioned, Queensland production, Queensland production of gas in Queensland has decreased by about 25 PJs compared to Q4 21. But the exports have decreased by 29 PJs, meaning there's essentially 4 PJs of additional gas supply available in the domestic markets, which is the highest since the highest Q4 since 2019, which is what this chart here is showing. So that's part of that is to do with the nature of these LNG projects as coal seam gas, which limits, there's only so much you can turn down the production. You can't just switch it off. It's still producing energy just at a lower level. So gas, sorry, at a lower level. So that's part of that reason for that increase in domestic supply. All right, and then to finish it off on the right, we see the Iona underground storage levels. So Iona underground storage in Victoria is the main storage facility across the east coast. So generally fills up over this time period, over the summer period where gas demand is low, and it gets built up until the start of winter, and then winter really starts drawing down. So the solid sort of thicker line there, calendar 20 is calendar 22. So we can see it started off around 13 PJs, increased near to its capacity. Its capacity is not shown here, but I believe it's like 24-ish. I mean, I think that calendar 21 line is pretty close to its all-time capacity. And both in 21 and 22, which had very cold winters, that gas supply got really drawn down in. And both calendar 21 and 22, but in particular 22, which the rate of decline we saw led to AEMO issuing notices there. And we can see since that time, the Iona underground storage has been slowly been refilled. There was an outage at that facility in November, December, where it was just maintenance. It was planned maintenance. And then post that, we saw a lot of that extra gas being sent underground into gas storage. And so probably the biggest reason for that was just lower gas-fired generation. Another big factor was that that QC LNG reducing its LNG exports. So if that hadn't happened, potentially wouldn't have increased as much, because there would have been increased flows north. So I believe as of today, it's not exactly sure, but it's quite high, the Iona underground storage. So at the moment, at least, it's looking fairly good for calendar 23, and the drawdown really just had to do with temperatures this winter and how we go. And I believe that's the end of my presentation, Pierluigi.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Shaun. Yeah, let's see how we go this winter. Indeed, there's a question from the audience that's about lack of reserve. It says that AEMO published lack of reserve 1 notifications to encourage the generators to provide more supply and large energy users to reduce their load at specific time intervals. Is there a direct relation between critical peak demand days and lack of reserve levels? If there happens to be a critical peak demand, would there be suspected lack of reserve following spike in pricing?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure the answer, but I guess I believe that there is a good link between lack of energy, lack of reserve, and those critical peak days. What else can I say on that? Yeah, I mean, throughout Q4, we didn't really see a lot of very peaky days, very days that were high temperatures, high load. I'm not sure what else I can really mention on that.
Yeah, no, that is thanks, Shaun. The other question is about the Iona store. How low can it go, and what happens if it goes too low?
That's a good question. I believe we did have this question last quarter. I think it's 6 PJs. It's limit. I know once it starts going around that level, there's issues with flow rates. It's hard to get the gas out because less pressure, I suppose, and it's going out. And that's why the chart here sort of goes down to 8, because it's like a theoretical minimum. but yeah, it's definitely issues with flow rates when it gets that low.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, it's very likely the way. So I don't know if there's any other question that you may have, but otherwise I would just like stop it here for today. And yeah, thanks again, Shaun. I give the word back to Franca to conclude the webinar. Thanks so much, and thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to Shaun and Pierluigi. Bye-bye.
Thank you.